Wow. First of all, thanks, Vittorio, Paul, and Christopher. I'm an investor, so I love hearing about businesses. It's fascinating to hear about the different businesses now making up the Alberta landscape. Nice to hear that there's no energy companies amongst that mix, so some of that diversification you're talking about. And thank you, Sean Dell. It's, as he mentioned, we've known each other a long time, going back over 20 years. We served on the Calgary CFA Society board together. We started when we were 10 years old, so that's why we still look so good. So it means a lot to have you sponsor that and introduce me. So thank you for doing that. So anyway, I'm going to warn you, this is not an investment outlook, which is typical for many investment firms you talk about. Instead, this is a talk on what I don't hear a lot being talked about in the industry generally, and particularly amongst investment firms, which is a culture, and in this particular case, a culture of an investment firm. This is a particular story in terms of how you take a small Calgary-based company, which we were 20 years ago, from $1 billion in assets to $85 billion in assets. And the best place to start this story, I'm going to read you the first paragraph of Chapter 2 from this book called High Performing Investment Teams. Now, this is a story that might resonate for some of you. It might be something you've seen or heard in your own organization. And it goes like this. The Canadian-based firm had a problem. Despite financial success and general goodwill amongst the partners, there was a chasm between the junior and senior partners that was threatening the company's success. The problem was one we often see in a privately held money management firm: ownership. In this case, 9 partners were owners, with the 3 founding partners holding the largest portion, over 50%. The line had been drawn in the sand, and the positions for each faction were predictable. The founders claimed that they deserved the lion's share for taking the early risk and providing a platform for the Young Turks to perform on. The Young Turks claimed that they were now bringing in most of the new business and should be rewarded accordingly. The battle for ownership had been raging for nearly 2 years, and no discernible progress or change on either side. The effect that the argument was having on team morale was becoming pronounced, with several Young Turks beginning to mutter about splitting off and starting their own firm. In our view, that action was likely to be lose-lose for all involved. And that's how I have books to this day, and iPads don't have that original copy. But that might be a story might resonate for some of you, the differentiation between the senior and younger generation in a firm. And for us, that was very much where we were in 2003, with approximately $1 billion in assets, essentially on the verge of civil war at that point in time. Now, to back up a little bit, we were founded in 1974 by Chuck Moore at the age of 57, which I find amazing and is an interesting story in itself. But Chuck had a storied career. He fought in World War II. He was a gunnery officer aboard the HMCS Haida, which was one of the ships that took troops out to France on D-Day. And today, as you can see, we're over $85 billion. So it took us 30 years to get to $1 billion, and then 20 years, the last 20 years, to $85 billion. So what happened? In short, we figured out our culture. Now, culture is defined as a set of beliefs, values, behaviors that differentiate one organization from another. You all have culture in your own firm. Every firm has culture, just whether you're intentional or unintentional about it. Ours was very much built on the foundation that Chuck created in 1974. I remember the first time I had lunch with Chuck, kind of a venue like this. And this was in the late 90s, after I started at the firm. He had since retired. And at the end of lunch, he looked across the table at me in kind of his deep voice as he spoke about it. And he goes, "Craig, remember, that's my name on the wall. That's pretty intimidating when you're 20 years old and you have a founder that says, remember, that's my name on the wall. Then he went on and he goes, as long as you always do the right thing, I never have to worry about my name being on the wall. So I very much see that as my legacy to this day. And that was our culture at the time. Just do the right thing, your word is your bond. And that worked when we had 3 owners within the firm. But as we were inviting new owners into the organization, each with their own set of values and beliefs, culture will begin to change if you're not intentional about it. So that's what we had to figure out in 2003, and really what sets us apart to this day. So what is our beliefs, values, and behaviors? This is our purpose statement: provide our clients with financial peace of mind and help rid the world of investment evil. Which is simply another way of saying do the right thing, as Chuck often would say. Now, investment evil for us, as we see it in our business, comes in a number of different ways. We see fraud a lot in our industry. We see products coming out to the marketplace that really exist to gather clients' assets with no intent to providing value to clients at the end of the day. So we see that we can ultimately rid the world of investment evil through 3 main ways. One of which starts with the types of companies we invest in. These are companies that add value to society. In terms of how we serve our clients, ultimately being fair and transparent to them. And also in terms of how we manage our business. And ultimately that's about looking after our employees. We also like to say we want to rid the world of management evil. So 20 years ago, going back to 2003, before we could solve our ownership problem that I talked about, we needed to agree on a common set of behaviors that would really allow us to communicate with one another. And this was the origin of the core 4 behaviors that you see here. Now, the interesting thing about each of these behaviors, they each come with their own language and meaning that really developed a foundation for us to communicate with one another. A good example is curiosity. When we talk about curiosity, we talk about whether we're above or below the line. If we're above the line, we're open and curious. If we're below the line, we're closed and defensive. And in 2003, we were very much closed and defensive. We talked more than we listened. And in that environment, it's very difficult to solve problems. Kind of reminds me of how I see politics really around the world. So like, when's the last time you saw a political discussion in North America that was open and curious? It just doesn't happen, right? That's why problems don't ultimately get solved. So the first commitment we made to one another was a commitment to play above this line that you see here. Once we made that commitment with one another, we started to brainstorm solutions to our ownership problems that we really hadn't considered before. Now, another of our values is candor. And when we talk about candor, it's about differentiating fact versus story. Now, in 2003, the language we often heard around our table was, the fact is, or my favorite, let me be clear. Now, ultimately what we had to come to acknowledge is that facts really are something that's inarguable. If I say a minute has 60 seconds, that's really inarguable. You can't argue. That's the fact. You can say the fact is a minute has 60 seconds. The best way to transition ownership, well, that is arguable, so don't state it as a fact. So the second commitment we made to one another was to differentiate fact versus stories, and to learn to hold your stories lightly. So what we used to say is the fact is this is the best way to transition ownership became it's my story that this is the best way to transition ownership. Now to try that with one of your own beliefs. Start it with the fact is, and then try it with my story is, and see which one is more readily received by the listener. Now, it was only once we made these commitments to these behaviors that we were able to align ourselves around a set of values. Now, even the ordering of these values holds special importance for us. I remember us having a debate, you can call it an argument, around what should be top of the list. Should it be act with integrity or put clients' interests first? And it was only after someone at the table said, well, it's my story that we wouldn't jeopardize the reputation of the organization by putting a client interest first. The light bulbs all went off and said, well, of course, that's obvious. So act with integrity went top of the list. Now, for us, these behaviors and values are more than words on a wall. They really are a way of life. And the way we make them a way of life in the organization is to indoctrinate them across the organization with every employee. With every employee, we make sure that they are aligned with these values and behaviors. And that's important because otherwise your culture isn't going to stay consistent if that's the case. Now, we did this initially after the senior team committed to live these values and behaviors. We rolled it out across the firm through firm and team offsites. These firm and team offsites continue to this day. And it's also part of the onboarding process with every new employee that comes into the organization. So imagine you're a new employee starting at Moore today. This is going to be one of the first things that you see when you come into the organization. This is our intranet at the firm, and this is a set of 20-day videos and worksheets that every new employee goes through to learn the core 4 behaviors. It takes 20 days to learn the core 4 behaviors, and I can attest it takes a lifetime to master those behaviors within our organization. Now, the second thing we wanted to do, we realized the only way to really bring values to life within the organization is to exemplify how these values are being used to make decisions across the firm. So what we asked every employee to do across the organization is to submit a story of something they've seen in the firm that exemplified a decision that honored one of the values within the firm. And those stories went into a book that you see here called Values in Action. So a couple of stories that come out of the book, one of them is called It's a Piece of Plastic. And it's when we moved into our office, and there was a coat room in our office, and in the early days, it was often being used as a change room when people would run and bike into work. The only problem with the coat room is no lock on the door. So a little embarrassing when you're changing and somebody walks in on you. So after a few times of this, our chair at the time, Jim Hall, said, boy, it should be nice if we had a do not disturb sign for that door. And as you might expect, a couple of weeks later, young analyst comes back from a research trip with a do not disturb sign that he picked up at his hotel. And Jim looked at him and said, well, did you pay for that sign? And young analyst kind of looked sheepishly at him and said, well, no, it's just a piece of plastic, right? Jim said, well, I want you to call the hotel and ask him to put a charge on the bill for the sign. And so he went and called the hotel, and the hotel actually kind of laughed at him and said, of all the things that people take from our rooms, the last thing we're worried about is a do not disturb sign. The lesson in there is when your number one value is act with integrity, there's no small breaches in integrity. Now, another story from the book is around closing funds. And the interesting thing around in the investment business is that bigger isn't necessarily a sign of being better. It's not necessarily the same economies of scale that you see in your own business. And the reason is, as you get more and more assets to invest, it gets more and more difficult to find investments or companies to invest in that are going to add value for your clients. And so what we do for each one of our mandates is that we do close it to new clients once it gets to be a certain size. And so we did this with our Canadian equity fund at the time, which at the time was our largest and fastest growing fund within the organization. And it was about 2 weeks after we closed it, we had a prospective client come to us and wanted to invest $1 billion into this mandate. Now that's pretty significant. At the time, we were at $10 to $15 billion in assets. It would add a significant amount to our revenue and the value of our ownership. But ultimately, we looked at the prospective client and said, no, we put clients' interest first. If we were to make that decision and take those assets, it would be very much in the short term. Over the long term, ultimately, without the ability to add value to clients, we'd ultimately lose those assets at the end of the day. So that's another example about putting clients' interest first. So this book, Values in Action, once again, shared part of the onboarding process with every new employee that comes into the organization. Our new way of doing it last year is the second version of it. We did what we called a hackathon. It was the first time we brought all our employees together post-COVID, and we sat around like tables of this, approximately tables 5 or 6. And this is essentially a new generation telling stories of how they see us making decisions in the firm that live and are made by the values of the organization. So they went around and told stories, and then they voted on the best story. And that person then stood up and told the entire firm that story, and we videoed that. So the second version of Values in Action isn't a book at all, but it's actually a series of videos. So, where are we today? Well, we're still independent. We did stay together. We did solve our ownership issue. We agreed to a formula and brought in an external bank to finance the ownership transactions. And instead of 9 owners, today we're 74 owners. They all work within Moore, except for one recent retiree, so 73 plus 1. And the reason that's important is our greatest asset is our people. Ultimately, an investment business, that's what adds value within the organization. So we attract and retain the best people through ownership. And the other thing that allows us to do is also to align the interest of our clients with our own, because as our clients' portfolios grow, and then the value of our ownership grows. So one of the big reasons our turnover amongst top performers within the organizations has been essentially 0%. Where we're going today, we are on what we call Moore 4.0. This is the 4th version of a strategic plan we've had at Moore in the last almost 50 years. And it's in the form of what you see here is a strategy atlas. It's called a strategy atlas. A good example of how our culture continues to iterate to this day as well. It's a strategy atlas, because if you think of when you get a world atlas, the first page is a map of a globe, and then you can dig down and see the map of each underlying country. This is the strategy for the firm. And each box in blue is a capability that we need to achieve our strategic goals within the organization. Starts with our competitive advantages, which we see as top talent, performance alpha, client alpha. Now alpha is just simply another word for adding value. And high performance organization, once again, how you manage the firm, which also includes the culture of the organization. Now, in terms of each one of those boxes as well, each one of those boxes also has its own strategic plan as well. So you can now dig into each one of that, and this would be the strategic plan for how we attract and retain top talent in the organization. And the one I wanted to draw your attention to, it's under career success, the 3rd gray box down, which is aligned with your area of genius. And so we define an area of genius as a person's career intersection, which is a combination of 3 things. It's what an individual loves doing, they're passionate about it, they'd actually do it even if they weren't getting paid to do it. But they're also good at it. They got skills and training and experience in it as well, and it adds value in the organization. So the combination of those 3 things, what you love doing, you're good at, adds value to the organization, is your area of genius. And I was reminded of this. I was listening to a podcast recently, the Freakonomics podcast. It was called Why Are There So Many Bad Bosses? And the thesis of the podcast is that people get promoted to their level of incompetence. Sounds like a pretty dire situation in most of our firms. And so why do people get promoted to their level of incompetence? Because they ultimately get promoted to a role that they just don't love or have skill in anymore. And for some, this is people management. And so one of the reasons we have and try to achieve a relatively flat hierarchy within our organization is that we don't want to differentiate between people management and being an individual contributor in terms of compensation. And that's in order to incent people to work towards their area of genius. So how do we know if we're successful on our strategy? Is we have 4 stakeholders at Moore. which is another advantage of being independent, is that we can serve 4 stakeholders, unlike what you hear in most public companies whose main mission is usually to maximize value for shareholders. We serve 4 stakeholders: clients, employees, owners, and society. Now, if you take the first letter, somewhat intentional, of each of that, it's CEOS, CEOs. So it makes it relatively easy for people to remember in the organization. We're boring, we're just not incredibly original in terms of how we do things. And under each is a key performance indicator that indicates is a sign of success for that particular stakeholder. So as an example for employees, we have an annual culture and employee engagement survey. And one of the questions in that survey is, would you leave more for less money? Would you leave more for the same amount of money? Would you leave more for more money? I know, a little bit of pun there. Or would you leave more for substantially more money? And if you're in those latter 2 categories, that you would leave more for more money or substantially more money, you're considered a happy camper or a raving fan. And I can't remember this particular indicator for us as ever being less than 80% as long as we've been doing the measure. So in conclusion, the roots of our success is rid the world of investment evil, commit to a set of common behaviors, align around our values, recognize these aren't words on a wall, it is a way of life. You get it to be a way of life by indoctrinating every employee in the organization. You get every employee to work within their area of genius, and at the same time you rid the world of management evil. After all, it's still Chuck's name on the wall. So, what's your version of 1 to 85 billion? Identify things that you would need to indoctrinate in your culture, and if you intentionally turn it into a way of life, your success will be inarguable. At least that's my story. Thank you. Yeah.
Anyone have questions? Sandra will cover that side, and I'll cover this side.
Thanks so much for that. That was so insightful. I'm quite curious if you had to apply, say, Pareto principles, so the 80-20 rule, for your talent spreadsheet, the slide that you shared, which was very deep. What would you say you got most return on that? What 20% would you say resulted in the most return for talent retention? Because that's a very big issue a lot of people are facing today, let alone attraction to an organization.
Yeah, no, it's, sorry, what's your name? Ken?
Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. It's a really interesting question, and it's different today than what it would have been 20 years ago. As we were building an organization, it was really about getting the right people on the bus. That was where we spent 80% of our time. And also equally important is getting the wrong people off the bus. That was kind of what happens when you put a culture in place. And you don't have to work that hard at it, because what happens once you get a culture in place that everybody's aligned around is those that aren't aligned around it get themselves off the bus. So you don't even have to ask them off the bus. So that's where we spent 80% of our time today. 20 years ago. Today, where we spend 80% of our time is in the latter 2 categories, is helping people find their intersection, what they love doing, getting them in the right roles within the firm. And how you do that is through the people leaders, is training them how to help their people find their area of genius. So we spend a lot of time in terms of people development, training the people leaders. We didn't have the luxury to do that 20 years ago. It was just like, let's get the right people on the bus. And now, so the focus is very much different. Now we don't have to work as hard as in terms of the right people on the bus, because people seek us out now, given what we've been able to develop. So, yeah. Thanks for that.
And Sean?
Yeah, thanks for that, Craig. My question revolves around the approach is second to none, very well thought out, and obviously took a long time to implement, but the results speak for themselves. The question I have is, how would the approach be different if you were advising, because obviously your firm is made up primarily of professionals, so for someone like August Electronics, lead doctor or Prairie Vertical Farms, how would the approach be different, even just subtly, with respect to a difference between professionals and, say, line workers or people who work on a factory floor?
Yeah, I don't see it any different at all. Like, yeah, we just happen to be an investment organization. If you were to invite me to come and work at Prairie Vertical, I would do it exactly the same way. It's got to start with having everybody aligned around a common set of values and behaviors. Before you get to the values and behaviors, though, it just starts, okay, what's your belief, what's your mission of a firm? And as we talked about earlier, is like one of your missions is like use less water in the world, which is an admirable mission. I love that, right? And people will get behind that in today's world of using less water, but being more environmentally sound. So that's an admirable mission that people will rally around. Once you have those people, then it's like, okay, well, how are we going to behave within this organization? Because that's what's good, and that's the only way we're going to be able to communicate. Because we all have different communication styles. Like a lot of what goes in behind the behaviors as well is we do different types of personality testing and training. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just that we all have different communication styles. And once you recognize that in each other, then it's like, okay, well, we recognize that, but what's the platform that we want to all commit to? So be curious. It's like continuous learning. Be candid. Like, we don't want, if you got something on your mind, speak it, because that's why you have a diverse group of people around you, is that only works if you can all get everything out on the table, and then you get to some semblance of a truth. You'll never get to the truth, but you'll get to some semblance of a truth from that. What do you value, right? And so that's where I'd start. And then once that is like, that's coming back to the 80-20, is 80% of why people will come and want to work and love what you do. Like, we don't talk about work-life balance. We just call it life. Like, we live life. It's like, don't come here to work. Come here to live, right? So that's exactly where I would start. Not for just an investment organization, but manufacturing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be people that drive the success of it. You just have tools around you that will make it happen. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition to 74 owners and maybe some challenges that you've had with that?
Yeah. So the question is the transition to 74 owners and some of the challenges with that. Well, the main one was the one that was kind of the basis of this presentation, was just figuring out how to transition ownership. Because we just stopped at 9 is what happened. And the reason we stopped at 9 is the ones with the biggest ownership positions just didn't want to sell anymore, because it just wasn't economical for them, right? And so that's where that struggle came from. It was like, well, we're bringing in all this business. He's like, give us a share of the rewards. And it's like, well, we're not going to sell it. Just at that price, it just doesn't make sense, right? And so it just became this clash, right? And it was lose-lose. We're just looking out for each other's, our own interest, as opposed to trying to find a win-win. And then at the end of the day. And so that's why we just had to get out of that conversation, take a step back, and as essentially the group that you saw that came in was Focus Consulting that helped us, and it's essentially just a marriage counselor. Actually, one of the guys was a marriage counselor, right? And it's the same basis of any successful marriage as well. It's just based on the basis of strong communication. So it's just, okay, let's take a step back, put in the foundations of communicating with one another, which was through the behaviors that we committed to. And then we were able to then figure out and then look and realize what each other's interests were. And once we were able to solve that ownership issue, and then 9 to 74 went a lot quicker than 1 to 9.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Nathan.
So I'm overseeing the transition of a family enterprise at the moment from Generation 1 to Generation 2. Gen 1 was very much by the chargeable hour, the sweat equity, and we're looking to move more into digital solutions, digital transformation, really kind of modernize the business. And that takes a different skill set. And what we're finding is that we have those subject matter experts that are starting to transition out just due to retirements and aging out, if you will. And then we're bringing in, tech-savvy talent, and we're really bringing in the necessary skill sets. Having a bit of trouble bridging the gap, and I think a lot of what you said today speaks to that. Like, we're trying to transition out of a service model into more of a scalable model, but keep the value sets the same. Like, keep what got the company through the first 40 years, and give it another, but with a different layer to it. I guess the question is this: I'm trying to impress upon Generation 1 the importance of culture, because I think that the drivers are different for the younger workforce. Any sound bites would be appreciated. It's a daily pitch.
Yeah. I hear you. That's why we bring someone like you in, Nathan, is to help us solve that one, right? But what I can say to it is one of the biggest things we've debated, and I don't think we have ever landed on a solution for this, but I think this is this comes to the soundbite you're looking for, is that we've always argued, do you hire for culture first and then teach them the skills, or do you hire for the skills and teach the culture, right? And for the longest time, at least in the early days, it became about hiring for culture and then teaching them the skills. And today, more recently, and I think it's because of where we're seeing the world go with from a technology perspective, with a number of things that we just don't get anymore, is hiring for skills and then teaching them the culture of the organization. That's just really on a continuum now. That's two ends. The right answer is somewhere in between that, right? And ultimately, it's pretty tough to bring someone in with a tough skill set that's just not at all going to be a fit for the culture at all. Like, if they don't value integrity and it's dog eat dog for them, that just becomes cancerous within your organization. So that's why it's somewhere on that continuum, and for every organization it's going to be a little bit different.
So I have to assume then you put a lot of time and energy into talent identification from the front end, and really screening your candidates, really making them not run the gauntlet, making sure you know that the expectations up front are clear, and that the onboarding is going to just take them that extra step.
Yeah, no, they run the gauntlet for sure. Yeah, it would be unusual, particularly among senior roles, for them not to meet at least a dozen different people, right? And now the other part of that, which is interesting, and we've gone back and forth around this, is talent identification. When you have them meet that many different people, what we're finding is they'll usually land on a consensual candidate, which we were finding wasn't actually working out for the organization. And that's because you're giving decision rights to the group to make this decision. And when you do that, someone's going to, probably one of your highest prospective candidates is going to get vetoed by someone within that group. And as a result, you kind of steer away from it. And so where we started to move to with this model, and we talk a lot about decision rights in our organization, is we gave decision rights, we moved it off group decides to an individual decides. A leader decides with input. And so it's the leader that will make the decision on that particular candidate by getting the input of those 12 people, but not giving any one person essentially a veto on that candidate. And so we've found that has worked a lot better for us.
Hey, appreciate sharing that, Craig. This is amazing, and having interfaced with a number of your team members, and I've shared this with you before, it definitely shows in the organization. It permeates throughout it, and I think I'm a big believer in incentives, and ownership is a big part of that. I guess the question that I'm rambling towards is, you work in a competitive marketplace, and I've said it to clients before that just to get them thinking is that, so not only nice people that make you money, it's potentially people you don't like or like less. So I guess in a competitive marketplace, you didn't say anything about that in terms of returns matter. How do you reconcile that with culture really matters, but returns also matter to the long-term success?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Steve and I used to be neighbors, so when he says he's interfaced with a number of people in the organization, he's interfaced with me in my underwear at the door, so he's got an intimate view of that one. So he didn't ask me that question on a Sunday morning after I slept in. But one of the and it's another great question, because this is actually one we're wrestling right now, which is essentially it's how do you evaluate each other, and it's not just who's a great cultural fit, right? And so the framework that we've landed on for now for evaluating people is what we call 3 C's. I had something to do with it given my name, but one of the C's is contribution. It's contribution. Second C is character, and then the third C is criticality to the organization. And that kind of speaks to what you're talking about. So the second C is essentially cultural fit. And so you don't want to have people just in the organization that are great cultural fits, nice organization to work at, but aren't contributing to the success and strategy of the organization. And so that's why that first C, contribution, is important. And so on the research side, performance does matter. If you're not adding value for clients, but you're a great cultural fit, ultimately, we will look for what we call the graceful exit from the organization, or maybe it's a graceful exit into another role within the organization. But that's part of the discussion. And then that third C is criticality as well, because that then matters in terms of whether you're going to decide to make an exit for somebody. If it's, as Shondell said, as a frontline worker or maybe a support role, and their contribution's so-so, but their criticality is also so-so within the organization. So you're not, you don't have to disrupt the culture if it's in that particular case. But if the criticality is in a research role that's driving performance, or a management role where they're responsible for the direction of the business, then that's going to tell you that, you do have to make a decision if one of the other two are falling down. Jason?
What I'd love to know is, from the moment you identify the beliefs and values, you've got alignment. Through all of the growth that's occurred, if there's one of the beliefs or values that has become a little more difficult to manage and ensure that it stays the right way inside an organization, and if so, how you dealt with it?
Yeah, it'd be candor, by far and away. And it's probably always been the most difficult behavior to manage within the organization. Accountability, yes, as well, but maybe a little bit less so. But candor is, it's just, at least in Canadian society, we get, other people from different cultural backgrounds that candor comes easier just because that's how they raised. But in Canadian society or North American society, people are a little bit more reserved, I find. So to be able to pull that out, that's why I say it takes a lifetime to master, is that you're always thinking more about what the other person's going to think as opposed to what needs to be said. And so as we continue to grow and new people come into the organization, and now as we've gone increasingly global with different cultural backgrounds in the organization, you're now not only managing that within one culture, you're managing that amongst different cultures where it's means totally something different. Like, we do have a Singapore office, and the people in the Singapore office very much grow up to respect your elders and never to say anything that might potentially insult them. So to get them to speak candidly, which is critically important, otherwise it's gonna lead to some problem down the road, is, so it just takes on a whole new dimension. So it's always been there. Even more so now, I think, as we've gone increasingly global. And as I said, accountability is holding people accountable. Coming back to what Steve says, is if they're not doing what they say they should be doing. Right? So.
We have one more question, then we'll close.
Okay.
Yeah, just to piggyback off the neighbors and underwear conversation. You had another wonderful slide, your 4 Whys, the CEO's acronym. How do you ensure that on a go-forward basis? Like, are those 4 sections tied to KPIs for the leadership teams, or is that more anecdotal, where you do a survey, you get a result, and you say, we can talk about this? How can you continually reinforce that, especially the more qualitative elements, like your clients, your employees? Assets under management is more measurable statistically, but those pieces that are more qualitative, how did you enforce that at the organization?
Yeah, well, it's first of all, the leadership is accountable to this. It's it's part of what the organization is all about. And so, yeah, and actually the two most important ones are the first two, clients and employees, which you're right, are qualitative, right? Well, the first two measures you see there are qualitative. Net Promoter Score, so that comes out of a client survey that goes out, is would you recommend more to your friends and colleagues, and so that's on a measure of 1 to 10, and so there's a measure for that. But there's other sub ones under that. Retention rate, our ability to retain clients would fall under that as well. So if you're losing clients, there's even if their Net Promoter Score is high, it's telling you something's wrong there as well. Employees, it's not just around their loyalty as well. There's a number of engagement measures that go through it as well. So you find ways. Ultimately, we're investment people. We want to try to quantify everything. So we take the qualitative and try to quantify it as best as we can. And then a lot of it is just talking to people. Like one of my main roles now as board chair is in terms of these stakeholder relationships. So I meet with clients and employees all the time and just, hey, how is it going? And you get stuff that just doesn't come out through surveys as well, and you can pass that on to leadership as well. And you also have to build a relationship of trust to make sure that can happen as well, because no one's, as a client or employee, is going to tell you much if they don't trust that it's not going to have repercussions on them as well. So that's a big part of when you're building those relationships, to make sure you're building it on a foundation of trust, which is a whole other story as well. Yeah, thanks, Ken.